Hi, my name is Rebecca Fannin. I'm the host of Silicon Dragon Talk. Today we're going to be talking about Hong Kong startups and a reality check. We have three expert guests with us today. We have Tytus Michalski of Fresco Capital. Welcome, Tytus.
Thank you, Rebecca.
And we have Melissa Guzy from Arbor Ventures.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Good. And Simon Squibb from Nest Investments.
Nice to see you again.
So we have had a full week of non-stop startups in Hong Kong, and even trams have advertisements for Startup Hong Kong on the front of the tram. So is this too much? Is there just too much hype around this right now, or is this really good for Hong Kong startups to have this kind of buzz happening? What do you think, Tytus?
Well, I think it's a question of we need to have a balance of style and substance, right? And so, of course, it's great that we have 45 events about startups this week, but also it's important not to forget that building companies is really hard, and going to events doesn't build the company. You actually have to go back and build the business. So as long as we don't forget that, I think it's positive. And so it's a marathon and not a sprint.
Exactly, it's a very good point. And Melissa, what do you think of all the hype and the buzz and the style and the substance points that Tytus just brought up?
Well, I agree with him. I think having come from Silicon Valley and then to Hong Kong, I think one of the challenges is what happens next. So there's these 45 events, but really what's the follow through and what are we really doing for the entrepreneurs in the city? And is this really helping them? Or is this a matter of a showcase and not much substance, and that's yet to be seen?
Right, right. So are there some winners emerging, do you think, Simon? Are we seeing some winners beginning to emerge from Hong Kong? Because that's been one of the weak points of Hong Kong in relation to Beijing and Shanghai, that Hong Kong really hasn't had any of these star entrepreneurs yet. So you think we're going to get these out of this kind of activity that's happening now and the kind of energy that's happening?
Yes, I see a huge opportunity for Hong Kong. I think there's a slight misunderstanding. It's not just the local market and the local entrepreneurs, although that is part of the mix. It's Hong Kong's ability to seamlessly connect East meets West. That's where the opportunity is. So I think what's happened with the Start Me Up Week this week in Hong Kong, there's signs that the government is getting behind it. This is important, it's part of the ecosystem. The actual entrepreneurial community here in Hong Kong is very wealthy. The money here has gone to these events and got involved. I think the secret to it all is not thinking of Hong Kong as the next Silicon Valley, but Hong Kong being the next hub for startup innovation. So I see Hong Kong as a brain, taking the ideas and opportunities here and spreading them globally. It's not necessarily the domestic market that's the opportunity, or even necessarily just the local entrepreneurs, but it's a great city to live in. People want to live here. So.
Oh, it definitely is. Well, you brought up the government's role in the whole startup ecosystem here. Can the government really help to jumpstart startups? Because that has not been a core value in Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley is still the global hotspot of the world. So what do you think, Tytus?
Yeah, I think definitely when it comes to startups and building ecosystems, governments don't have the answer. So if we look at what it takes to build a startup ecosystem, it starts with the entrepreneurs. And then there's investors and mentorship and all these other great things. And yes, government has a role to play, but from our perspective, it's more about the regulatory environment, making sure you can get the right talent coming into Hong Kong, which I think is generally a strength of Hong Kong. So rather than thinking that we have to rely on the government to lead, it's about thinking of the government as one of the supporters of the startup ecosystem.
Okay, so sort of the Singapore model working in Hong Kong?
I don't think it works in Hong Kong. I think where the government can play a role and needs to play a role desperately at the moment is in the immigration visa problem. The issue is just way too difficult for foreigners to get a visa to come here who could join startups. The balance you have to have between locals and foreigners is not the right way about, going about attracting talent to the city. So I think before we even talk about what they can do for a specific, whether it's funding or specific companies, first thing they can do is make it a lot easier, which Singapore did do, to attract talent to the city. That's a fundamental building block that has to get resolved. And we don't see much progress in that area, even after really highlighting it for the last year, year and a half. So I think immigration is a very big challenge for Hong Kong.
Right, right, this whole talent question. And I think you brought up venture capital investment too, whether there's enough venture capital investment here in China. There's only a very limited number of venture capitalists here. We are starting to see some angel investors, but I think Singapore did a matching program for VC funds to get started. Is that something that Hong Kong should be doing as well, to have a matching program for VC funds to get established here?
I mean, Singapore is unique. And let's see whether Singapore really works 10 years from now, where the government is so intertwined in trying to build the ecosystem. But what has Singapore done really well? They went to Silicon Valley and they've attracted Google and LinkedIn and Facebook to start opening offices there to bring talent. And that talent works with those companies for a couple of years and then maybe goes on and does a startup. In Hong Kong, we don't have that either. We need somehow, some way to figure out how to bring the talent here. Venture capital follows talent. Money follows talent. And we were discussing this earlier today among the three of us. This is something we sort of collectively have to figure out how to do. And that comes from within the community. The only role I see for the government at the moment with the venture capital is one, either to start releasing funds to local venture capital firms, which they have not done either, unlike Singapore, which they have done recently. Right. And number two, help on the immigration visa issue. And also, when it comes to rent, perhaps create some facilities where we can lower the cost of rent for these startup companies. Mm-hmm. That's some of the role that they can play. Mm-hmm. But beyond, can they replicate Singapore? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. I don't think any place.
Anyway. Yeah, we don't want to replicate Singapore. Right. I think Hong Kong was quite different. I mean, someone described it quite interestingly to me recently that Singapore is equivalent to the iOS system, and Hong Kong is like the Android system. And I think what's exciting about the Hong Kong opportunity is here there are a lot of very successful entrepreneurs. And if you look at Silicon Valley success stories, they come from the PayPal mafia type, people that have made money in a startup, they've gone again and got involved in more startups. I'm myself an entrepreneur, I've made money in Hong Kong thanks to the Hong Kong infrastructure, and now I'm putting money that I've made here back into startups here in Hong Kong. And to me, that's the most important element. It's entrepreneurs backing entrepreneurs. It's not necessarily the government putting money in, taking taxpayers' money, hard-earned money from a taxi driver, his tax, and then putting it into a startup that may or may not work. I don't think government should pick winners. You have to let private enterprise do that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what Hong Kong has the opportunity to do. Yeah. Singapore is an interesting place, and my firm's been asked to go to Singapore quite a few times, but we stay here because I don't think it's good governments putting money into startups. Mm-hmm. I think it's good that private individuals lose their money in startups or make their money in startups, but I'm not going to take the taxpayers' money and put it into a startup. But what the government can do, as we've said a few times here today, is offer up the visa system. What Hong Kong does really well is provide the infrastructure and then get out of the way of business to let business go and make or lose money.
So I think we're talking about the talent pool, and if you look at Alibaba and PayPal and all of these serial entrepreneurs that came out of these huge success stories, do you think that has potential to happen here in Hong Kong, that you're going to see one giant company, unleash a whole bunch of, new mini entrepreneurs who go off and do their own entrepreneurial endeavors after they've been at these huge tech titans like Alibaba or like PayPal?
I don't think we have to sit around and wait for one giant success story, and just more generally on the issue of talent. I think sometimes when people look at individual markets, it's always tempting to say, oh, we've got a talent problem. But the reality is that even in Silicon Valley, it's not really easy to get talented people because you're competing with Google, you're competing with Facebook, you're competing with very well-funded startups. And so talent is a challenge everywhere. Hong Kong has its own specific issues around talent. And that's certainly something which every ecosystem needs to work through. So I think rather than sitting and waiting around for one giant success, it's how can we import more talent? How can we train up university students and get them excited about being entrepreneurs? And that is happening. So from the perspective of, is Hong Kong making progress on talent? Absolutely. Is there a long way to go? Definitely.
Yeah. So what do you see? Where do you see the challenges? You say that it's a long way to go. Where do you see the primary challenges?
Right. So there's a few things. I think in terms of companies as they go beyond the seed stage and scaling up, that's where Silicon Valley is really special. They have teams of people who have had several exits that come in at a more mature stage of a startup, stay for 2 to 3 years, and help that company get to the next stage. And we don't have those kinds of teams in Hong Kong. The good news is we have lots of big banks and other big companies where we're starting to get talent from those folks and bring them into the startups as they need to scale. And that's something that we're very active in doing with our portfolio companies to help essentially suck out talent from big companies and bring them into startups. And for them, it's a very easy decision because they can see the upside of joining a startup versus staying with some of the big banks where they know that the best days are behind them.
Yeah, that's something that mainland China has not had to wrestle with to get its startups and entrepreneurs going because they didn't have that investment banking, safety, security. And Singapore has had that same issue too, where people would rather go work for an investment bank than a startup. But do you think?
I can just add about the talent.
Yeah.
I'll just highlight something. I think there's a misconception. These days, I believe there's no borders anymore. So we keep talking about Hong Kong versus Silicon Valley, or Singapore versus Hong Kong, or Israel versus Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
But actually the truth is, with the cloud and the way things are built and the communication systems we have today, I don't think talent has to be in one place to deliver one product. These days, and many of our portfolio companies, they have their HQ here. It's very easy to set up a company here. The tax is low here. For the early stage, that's really good. And as they go into China, they may open an office in China and grab talent from there. I've got one company that's got talent in India working for them, talent in China working for them, talent in the US working for them, and they do it all with technology. So there's no longer a need to have all the talent in one place, i.e. Hong Kong or Silicon Valley. And if you look at Hong Kong in that respect, it's easiness to set up companies, it's low tax, it's transparent banking system, its ability to do early stage businesses here is second to none in my opinion. And that's why I think for us, I like the early stage investment. That's what we do early stage investment, because you can open a company quickly here, and if it doesn't work, you can close it quickly here.
Is there a real entrepreneurial culture here though?
There definitely is.
And Melissa, what do you think?
No, not really yet. I think
so. You two really are in big disagreement on this issue.
We spent a lot of time talking about this. I mean, Simon and I see each other, outside of the show as well. I think it's all about what's relative. I think it's the entrepreneurial culture is not yet here in the same sense that I've experienced living other places. Are we working collectively to try to develop it? Absolutely. Are we seeing signs of people taking that risk and leaving the investment banks who are talented? Yes. But it takes more than that. The ecosystem in Silicon Valley is 60 years old. People forget that. The ecosystem here is 2, 3, 4 years old. And so it's going to take a lot of time. The university students, get them comfortable that they don't have to go to an investment bank.
Right.
It's then getting mentors, to help mentor the startups here. It's getting follow-on financing that's maybe just not, local angels, but people who have really scaled companies. It takes a long time to develop an ecosystem. Even China is now 12, 15 years in the making. It's going to take time. So has it arrived? I don't think so by any means. I think, if anything, we've seen some entrepreneurs leave and open offices in other places. We have a lot to do.
Such as New York.
Yeah, so Demis Data, great, right?
You're one of your portfolio companies.
One of our portfolio companies started in Hong Kong, started in Simon's offices. It was very clear that we could not hire the number of data scientists we needed to. We had a global solution. We moved the headquarters essentially to New York. We still have a team here that's serving the Asian customers. But when it came to follow-on financing, and we have global VCs who invested after us, the number one question is, why do you need Hong Kong? You're too spread out. New York, Hong Kong doesn't seem to make sense. And we had a lot of explaining to do to have them understand the market opportunity. US VCs are focused on the US market for the most part. So it is a challenge to get them to come here. And that's one of our challenges. How do we get follow-on financing for our companies here in Hong Kong?
But I would just add that the point about talent, I think we're actually, in a way, we said exactly the opposite answer to the same question. Mm-hmm. The point is that Mark, who's running Demystify Data, started here. And what's exciting about this market is you have a lot of talent that's brought here, for example, by the financial institutions. The growth markets are China and India, right? So the Western organizations are all shifting resources and talent. The first stop for them often is this city. So in our portfolio company, and we're involved in 46 companies now, a lot of those people are overseas people that were moved here. Brains, intellectual people that were asked to come here by banks or by law firms to set up branches here or to build their Western brands here, fell in love with the city, didn't want to leave when the banks tried to move them again, and then started their own businesses. So this is a real East meets West culture, so the talent is there, and that talent that maybe is imported then trains the local entrepreneurs to step up and grab the opportunity. But it's not a local play. Like in Silicon Valley, it's not a local play. I mean, a lot of the entrepreneurs there aren't local born and local bred. There's 7 million people in Silicon Valley. There's 7 million people in Hong Kong. We're not building businesses with just the local talent and just locally to expand.
So what can we do to solve the venture capital gap that's here in Hong Kong? Would an answer be to attract more Silicon Valley type investors here? Would that work, or should it be more homegrown types of angel investors and VCs?
Well, I think it goes back to this point of, rather than thinking of companies as being specifically in one city, it's the fact that businesses are typically global from day one. So even for ourselves, more than half of our investments are in the US, and so our focus is on how do we bridge the gap between Hong Kong and Asia and Silicon Valley in the US. So we help our US companies come to Asia, we help our Asian companies go to the US, and increasingly we're seeing that trend where people are realizing that startups have to think global from day one. We're seeing Chinese companies investing more in the US. We're seeing larger US companies come over to Asia.
So do you think that your example will help Silicon Valley to open its eyes to this market and the potential here? I think, and that we'll see Sand Hill Road investors come into the market?
I think that's the bridge that we're helping to create, where they haven't necessarily done as much cross-border, but their portfolio companies are saying, we need expertise.
Right.
And so it's actually coming from the companies themselves, where they see business opportunities, they see competitive risk of moving too late.
Yeah.
So I think the investors will follow the companies.
Do these portfolio company entrepreneurs have to go to Silicon Valley to raise capital?
There's more choice now, right? So whether it's corporates from China, that, the BAT, that have a lot of cash to invest, or very active Japanese investors. A lot of people don't realize how active some of the younger entrepreneurs following SoftBank as well are across investing around the world.
Yeah.
And so there are more sources of capital, and capital is now not just one city.
Right. So Melissa, your Arbor Ventures invest in a number of markets. And you're very active in Southeast Asia as well as Hong Kong. How would you compare the kind of entrepreneurs that you're seeing in these different markets?
Well, we're a thematic fund, so we're not China or India, but we're thematic across fintech and digital commerce in all those markets. So I just got back from Tokyo this week. They're all different. What's really interesting about Asia now is there's engineering price parity. So engineers in Tokyo, Shanghai, Seoul, Singapore, even Hong Kong are about the same price or compensation, which makes it kind of interesting. I would say there's a rebirth of entrepreneurial spirit in Tokyo, and they can compete on a global level because the engineering is quite good. I would say in Southeast Asia, Jakarta is very interesting because of the number of returnees, very different than Singapore. Probably Singapore has less returnees compared to Jakarta. So we're seeing very interesting startups there. I'm headed to Sydney and Auckland next week. So, Australia's got some very talented startups there as well. So I think they're just very different. But I think at the end of the day, it's about the market opportunity in certain sectors and then the entrepreneurs that you're finding. But what we're seeing more and more is a lot more globalization of the entrepreneur than I think we've seen in the past. Even in Tokyo, I don't think 10 years ago you would see teams that were non-Japanese. I think the teams we're seeing now are a mix of returnees, locals, and people who have decided to move to Tokyo. Really unusual perception given how people think about the Japanese market. I think places like Jakarta, it's all returnees and then local teams as well.
What do you see as the strengths of the Hong Kong entrepreneur?
I think the area where we've been focused on is the strength here is you have a number of expats who have been moved here for the investment banks.
Yeah, just like Simon was saying.
Said,
yeah.
Very, very talented at the seniors level, where you don't tend to get is the middle talent level here in the investment banks. But the chief architects, the guys who have been building trading systems, they've been building cloud-based SaaS enterprise applications, and they know what they're doing. And I think that's a unique talent you don't see anywhere else in Asia, including in China. The real understanding of how to build next generation financial systems.
So maybe a more mature entrepreneur here.
Yeah, definitely
Okay.
much more mature and compared to the average age you see in Jakarta of 27.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I think here you're slightly older, but I think across our portfolio, our average age of our CEOs is 34.
Okay.
So across the spectrum
Yeah.
of Asia.
Simon, you're dealing with a number of young entrepreneurs. Is there one thing that kind of unifies them? Is there an area, is there a market sector that you think is really promising from Hong Kong? Or is there a type of entrepreneur that you think is really promising from Hong Kong that's going to make it? And what do you see as kind of the success trail? Do they have to go out of Hong Kong? Do they have to go to mainland China? Do they have to go to Australia, Indonesia, other markets?
Yeah,
Is there some sort of path?
There is.
Yeah.
There's a few trends that I've seen. I've been here 18 years, so I've seen a lot of things happen here. And one of the trends I've seen is you have, frankly, a huge population, very wealthy, China itself, that have sent their kids overseas for education. So they've gone to the US or they've gone to Europe. They've got an international education, and they come back and they have an advantage. They understand China. They understand Asia, but they also understand how the West works. The West is a little easier to understand. It's more transparent, you can argue. China is, of course, a lot more complicated. So you have these people come back. And Jack Ma Alibaba is a great example of this. He sees how it all works in the US, comes back with his understanding of China and builds what's now listed as one of the most valuable companies in the US. So, these people have an advantage. This is the trend. They come back well educated, understanding East and West cultures, and they're able to build businesses that perhaps businesses like Google in China haven't been able to build, and they are able then to take that wealth, that success, and that insight and go into the US market.
So you're seeing this whole returnee phenomena here in Hong Kong?
Yes, of course, it's here. Yes, absolutely. And I think the other thing as well
because
is
I saw it so strong in Beijing and Shanghai, but not necessarily Hong Kong.
well, are you based here? Do you live here?
Part-time.
Okay, I'm living and breathing this system, so I see it every day.
Yeah, but I see it in comparison to Silicon Valley
Yeah.
and Beijing and Shanghai and many other places around the world.
Yeah.
So
I see it here.
you do see the returnee phenomena here.
I mean, I've been full-time investing in startups for the last 4 years, and when I started investing, we used to get 4 or 5 applicants a month. I get over 200 a month now, applying for seed funding, for help with their startups. And you look at these entrepreneurs, they've got it. They've got something that perhaps even Silicon Valley doesn't have. They have that East meets West understanding, so they can really build a global business from day one. And here in Hong Kong, often the teams that I've invested in, they have international people in those teams from day one. So someone that knows Japan, someone that knows China, someone that understands India, someone that understands the US. And having invested in US companies and even companies just in Beijing, often in Beijing, they're just China teams. In America, they're just American teams. Whereas Hong Kong, and you look at Occupy Central as an example.
Wait. Being an American.
Yes.
What is an American team?
Well, they
it's
think
a collection of everybody who's immigrated
But they
to
think
the
they
US.
generally think the US market is big enough for you to just think about America. But the real opportunity is global now, right? That's the real opportunity.
Yeah, but there's an argument on the venture capital side, which is focus before you go global. So most VCs in the Valley would say, don't get distracted with anything outside of your market and your home
But you know,
country.
when raising money, you've got to talk big and have a big vision. And if you say, I'm only going to build a company in Hong Kong.
Wait. I don't think so for the VCs in the US. I think it scares them to death. And I think they haven't seen a company go global day one where it's been successful. I think their understanding is you focus on the home market, and then, when you're a couple $100 million, then you can go overseas. I think companies in Hong Kong are just forced to do that because we don't have a big domestic market or big market here.
I agree with you, except I would say it depends on what you're trying to achieve. I'm not asking my companies necessarily to go after money from VCs in the US. First of all, the whole trend, they don't invest more in a skateboard right away in the US, right? They've got lots of deals there already. So I'm seeing the investment actually come from the very, very wealthy entrepreneurs here. The guys that personally can do Series A on their own, right? So that huge wealth here gives a chance, I think, for the startups here to get funding.
So are we going to see some of these real estate tycoons getting involved in venture capital?
They already are.
Melissa disagrees with you, I think.
I don't think. I mean, to some extent, maybe.
I think the key for getting investors is what kind of value do they add besides money?
Yeah, that's right.
So it depends on what are the company's needs, and then yes, if the business needs certain expertise, and if that person doesn't have to be a venture capitalist, they can have specific domain expertise. But that's what we always work with our companies for: is what kinds of investors are you bringing to the table, and what do they bring to the table besides money? And that's really important.
So you don't think these real estate investors could bring too much value to the...
It depends on each one. Each one is unique, right? So if they bring something to the table, absolutely they can be helpful as investors. But it's not just the money.
Okay. Do you think that we're going to see an Alibaba out of Hong Kong ever?
Alibaba was listed in Hong Kong. I mean,
I
without
know,
Hong
but
Kong,
they
Alibaba wouldn't be
delisted
where it is
too,
today.
so.
Let's be clear. I mean, I don't know. It has indirectly been connected to Hong Kong.
Well, it has, yeah.
Yeah. So in
that's
fairness
a
to
very
Hong Kong,
indirect connection, though.
I think
listing
it's
Hong
too
Kong
early
But
to tell.
you know what I'm driving at.
It's too early to tell.
Too early to tell. Okay, so what is the next big success story from Hong Kong?
Well, I think we're at the intersection of the globalization of the renminbi. Somehow, somewhere in this financial service market, given the strength that we have here, we should see something emerge.
I completely agree with that. I think Hong Kong's got 3 areas where it could take advantage. Fintech. You've got Chinese banks and Western banks sitting side by side in this market, a real opportunity that's not in many other markets. In my opinion, education technology is also a big opportunity here. The wealth here in Hong Kong actually loves education. So and actually the push for education is going to come from developing countries, not Western countries, where they want to jump over schools in Africa where they can't afford to build the infrastructure. But Hong Kong can control that, help that, and develop that. And then I think the final one is wearable tech. Hong Kong has a real advantage in this space. People have been making stuff and shipping
Shenzhen,
stuff.
right?
Of
Across
course,
the
exactly.
border, the
Exactly.
hardware story. So Hong Kong can benefit from that.
Of course, exactly.
Yeah, I think the intersection of software and hardware, and then it's not just about technology, it's about how you apply technology to the real world. And so that's one of the strengths of Hong Kong is it may not necessarily be a core deep technology, but it's how do you apply that to the global market. And it's easy to forget, but Hong Kong is at the center of a circle where within 5 hours of flight time, you have half the population of the world. So it's geographically a good place to be. And so it's all about how can we apply technology to solve real world problems. And I think that's a really interesting, huge opportunity.
Okay, on that note, we could continue forever and ever on this topic and get even more controversial, but I think we have to wrap it up for now. And thank you so much for being on Silicon Dragon Talk here in Hong Kong, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.